Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel. Today I am here with Scott Baugh, the Republican nominee for California 47th for Congress. And just a little bit of background on the race in general. The upcoming 2024 election will see a very, very close race in terms of who is going to control the House, whether it be Republican or Democrat. And California 47th, right here in Irvine, is going to be one of the closest national races. And I'm proud to announce that both the Republican nominee, Scott Baugh, and the Democratic nominee, David Min, have each agreed to be on my podcast at some point this summer. This first podcast is going to be the Republican nominee, Scott Baugh. Just a little bit of background, Scott's team was incredibly welcoming and inviting. I had the chance to grab coffee with Scott, and then we subsequently recorded the podcast on another date. A special shout out to his campaign manager, Nick, who is super gracious and super helpful for setting everything up. And I'll just say just one more piece of background, that there was no topic that I brought up, both in one-on-one conversation before recording or during the podcast, that Scott was afraid to address, whether or not we agreed or not. So Scott is clearly a very genuine person, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Republican nominee for California 47th, Scott Baugh. Be here with Republican nominee for California 47th, Scott Baugh. And just to give listeners a little bit of background, this is presumably going to be one of the more competitive races this year for Congress in the upcoming election. So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Do I call you Rabbi? Or
no, Daniel Levine. Even the
right.
podcast is, J Life with Daniel. J Life with Rabbi Daniel didn't have the same ring to it. So I'm excited to talk to you, and I also told you that I'll be interviewing David Min in hopefully a couple of months. I wanted to start off with, some more challenging questions, and then we could get into stuff that I would imagine we have more agreement on, campus issues in Israel. Right. From my perspective, there's been a very scary eroding of liberalism within this country. It's clearly coming from both sides. We can probably agree on left-wing illiberalism, which we'll talk about in a minute when we get to campus. But I want to start with right-wing illiberalism. Do you see a threat to sort of liberal order, democracy coming from the right in any sense?
I see a breakdown of communication. I think that I like to refer to a school that I helped found in Newport Beach. It's a high school, and we exercise Aristotelian intellectual hospitality. And what does that mean? It means we don't accept an idea or reject an idea because of its source. We do our homework, and we study it, and we examine the idea, and we take the good, and we do away with the bad. And instead of an answer of A or B, often you come up with an answer of C that is better than A or B. And so I really try to approach these things by saying it's not Fox News, it's not MSNBC, because they're just talking past each other. And we're losing the art of conversation, and I think on both parties are losing the art of conversation and trying to come to a better solution for the American people.
And what do you think that's because? Is this social media? Is this just general two-party system politics?
Yeah, I think the social media, you've seen the Netflix show on that. It's siloed everybody, and it's everybody's basically just reinforcing everything they believe, and it's creating a lack of conversation. And it's the oddity is it's supposed to connect people, and it's really having the opposite effect. It's isolating people into different silos, which isn't healthy.
Sure, yeah, and from my perspective on campus, I can't tell you how often I talk to students about any issue. I mean, Israel-Palestine's obviously the big one lurking in the background. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but even other social issues where they've never even considered the other side, regardless of their opinion.
Right.
Needless to say, universities are not doing a good job at inspiring that type of open thinking. Academia has ceded way to activism in very dangerous ways, which, again, we'll talk about in a few minutes. Staying on the right, there's sort of two big questions that I think the wider Jewish community has. I took some polling of both students and grad students and Jewish community members in preparation for this interview. So the first obvious big one, it's not going to be a surprise for you, is Trump and questions of the 2020 election. Do you have any official statement on, who won the 2020 election, and what would you do in a future 2024 situation in which it came down to a vote of Congress?
Well, so I would say Joe Biden won the 2020 election because he's proven it. He's president. He's created inflation. He's created open borders. He's allowed wars to exist that we shouldn't have had with his poor leadership. And so, Joe Biden is the president of the United States.
So he's won, but done a terrible job.
Well, he's won. He did a terrible job, but that's not to say there weren't issues in that election. There were issues in a lot of elections, and there were some significant ones. And a lot of those states have changed the rules because of those improprieties that took place. But the challenge in an election is the window is very short to challenge the outcome. And it's really difficult to prove certain things in a short window of time. For example, if you're trying to prove fraud, boy, it takes you 2 or 3 years in normal litigation to prove that. You have to do all the discovery. The system isn't set up to prove fraud in a short period of time.
Sure. And so do you fear that any election, if you sort of look at it with a microscope enough, right, you have millions of people voting or hundreds of millions of people, there's always going to be some anomalies. Do you think 2020 was more? Is it just people are now better at catching, the individual cases of fraud that, almost certainly exist in any election?
I think 2020 was definitely more of an anomaly in the sense that you had, COVID, and you had all these ballots being floated out all across the country and in states all over, like here in Orange County, in California. They mail out 1.8 million ballots. There's ballots laying around everywhere, in dormitories and apartment complexes and some businesses. And so when you have that much opportunity for mischief, you're going to see more mischief.
And so what do you think the way to mitigate that is, right? As society grows and as people are more connected but also more siloed, there's only going to be more room for election nuances that, from any perspective are seen as unfair and things like that. Yeah. Do you fear that we're getting into a situation in 2024 and beyond where there's always going to be the party that loses saying there was something illegitimate and just holding up the government and sort of endless bureaucracy of, recount and back and forth?
Well, we've seen that when Trump won in 2016. We saw that Hillary Clinton said it was illegitimate, and a lot of the Democrats said it was illegitimate. This isn't new. It's been going on for quite some time. But I do think that a lot of states have addressed the issue. For example, in, I think, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they had these election bodies that didn't have the authority to change the election rules. They changed those rules improperly. And since then, that's been foreclosed, and they can't do that anymore. But that was improper to do, and so that was unique because of COVID. So COVID created quite an anomalous situation.
Yeah, so the other big question that the Jewish community had, this is sort of two parts of this question. One, let's stay narrow on social issues for a moment. The first time we met, we had talked a little bit about voting patterns in Jewish history. It's no secret, I told you that, Jews have been voting predominantly Democrat for the last 100 years, right? Really, that's because of, 1924 actually issues of immigration with Jews trying to escape from Europe. A lot of Jews also tend to be socially liberal. So issues such as, LGBTQ and abortion, and without even getting into my personal views on those issues, I'm curious what you would say to somebody who is seeing what's happening nationally with abortion, and maybe they agree with you on inflation, and they agree with you on the border, and they probably agree with you on Israel. We'll talk about Israel in a couple of minutes, but they say, I don't know, still because of abortion, it needs to be federally protected in some way.
I think, back to intellectual hospitality, I think if you sit down and had a conversation about it, you'd find out you agree more than you disagree. My view on abortion is in California, we know it's very legal. Prop 1 made it legal all the way to the 9th month. At the federal level, I don't think it's a constitutional issue. I don't think the federal government needs to be involved in the abortion issue. I think if the feds came in one way or another, put a floor or a ceiling on it, I think you're going to create more civil unrest in our country by doing that.
I see. So you would be against both federal, legality, but also federal attempts to block it top down.
Yes.
Okay. I think that's helpful context because, again, going back to all the siloed, element, a lot of Democrats view all Republicans as trying to stop abortions top down in every case.
Well, even Dave Mann, I saw him put out something today, said that I want to ban abortions national, for the whole country. It's like, it's just a lie. It's not true at all.
Got it. So it's not about banning it, but it's also not about a blanket acceptance. You want it to go back to the states.
And the states are sorting it out right now, where they're all going through their different efforts to establish or to restrict abortion, and that'll play itself out over the next few years.
Got it. And so zooming out a little bit, and we'll start to creep our way eastwards towards the Middle East. So obviously one of the big discussions in Congress, really for my entire life of following both American and Israeli politics has been questions of aid to Israel, which is, sort of reemerged in the public sphere. There's a growing tendency, it's obviously not as big as the left, so I want to preface it, for anybody listening, but we are starting to see the rise of Republican isolationists, right? This is probably more visible with Russia and Ukraine, but it's also starting to creep into questions of should the U.S. be helping fund the Iron Dome and everything like that. I'm curious if you have thoughts about this, the isolationist wing of the Republican Party and, how you might interact there. We can talk about Russia and Ukraine if you want, or we can just go straight to Israel.
Well, I'll talk about anything you want to talk about, but let's deal with Israel first. Israel's
Sure.
the only democracy in the Middle East. They're a friend of the United States. It's critical that we maintain our alliance and our partnership. I've written a paper on this. I don't know if you've seen the paper yet, but I think it's critical because if Israel goes down, the terrorism isn't going to stop at Israel. They're still coming to the United States. They've made it very clear. And as far as Israel's concerned, when Hamas says they want to destroy Israel, drive them into the sea, I think they got to take that pretty seriously. And I think Israel's doing the right thing, everything they can do to eliminate Hamas as an organization. It's a terrorist organization.
So in terms of aid, what would you say to, again, it's a small cohort of Republicans, but from just an observer of politics, there is a fear that grows, within the Republican camp. If you disagree, let me know, of Republican Congress men who would start to say America shouldn't be giving aid to Israel, even irrespective of the war, right? They're not against the war. They'd probably be in favor of the war, but just America shouldn't be footing the bill.
I don't see that happening. Israel is a partner of the United States, and it's a partnership that we will maintain.
Got it. And then what would you say on the flip side to Democrats? Obviously the Democratic Party is quite literally being torn in half over this issue. It'll be fascinating to see how this plays out in terms of the next election. Let's start with the ideology behind it. Why do you think half of the Democratic Party is now either anti-Israel openly or implicitly anti-Israel?
Boy, you'll have to check with them.
Okay.
They seem pretty divided and confused. In fact, most of them don't even know why they're protesting, so it's kind of bizarre to me that there's just, since this, it's almost like an oppressor oppressee type situation where they're always looking for it, and they found it here and they want to talk about it. It's a form of Marxism, and they're conflicted on it. And so I'm watching them try to dance on both sides of the issue, and it's kind of amusing at times.
Yeah, I don't remember which famous writer said this, but some quote of if your enemy is attacking itself, don't get involved, just stand back and watch.
Just hold their jackets and let them fight.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a very fair answer. So this issue of people not knowing why they're protesting and the lack of open intellectual inquiry has certainly come to campuses this year. I sort of see this as a firsthand observer, both as the rabbi for the Jewish community right here at a local university, UC Irvine, also in my position that's being now contested of teaching in the Jewish Studies department. I talked a little bit about that on my past podcast. I'll probably talk a little bit more on the future podcast. From sort of a bird's eye perspective, campuses handling protests, right? It's a really complicated issue because we want freedom of speech. Right? We don't want telling students...
It's a cornerstone of a healthy republic, really, is you have to have free speech.
And on the other side, we don't want support for terrorism coming out of our top universities, because that also doesn't look good for our nation. So in the most broad sense, and then I can narrow it down to some specific questions, do you see a tension between the campus protests and people, cheering Hamas slogans, free speech, when do you shut it down? Are people legally allowed to camp out in the middle of campus? There's a lot of thorny issues to dice out. And I'm curious, say you became president, say we're talking, now 2028, what would President Scott Baugh do in terms of what's been happening on campus?
I'm not going to engage in that kind of speculation, but let me just say this.
I said it, not you.
Yeah, let me just say this. The issue is free speech in proper tension with the rule of law. You have to maintain the rule of law. And when people start breaking the law, they need to be arrested. the protest needs to be shut down if they're blocking access or they're otherwise breaking the law. And it's that simple. I don't, and every situation is different. You've seen, Columbia, you've seen UCLA, you've seen UC Irvine. Every situation is different. Every administration has to handle it in the way they think is best in accordance with the facts that are confronted.
And so I guess, just to sharpen the question a little bit, I mean, I have strong opinions here, but I'm just curious to, throw it back to you. Not every breach of the rule of law, unless, you would disagree with the statement, requires police activity in terms of, coming onto campus. So a lot of the criticism that's been happening on really both sides is leaders of universities being hesitant to use police force in cases where they probably should, and then on the flip side, using too much police forces in cases where they probably shouldn't. And I'm curious what that proper balance is, because, of course, jaywalking is not legal, but I just saw, a minute ago someone run across, the street right here, and we probably wouldn't want there to be a police, waiting for them.
Daniel, I think as a general rule, our universities give the benefit of the doubt and allow a long rope for folks. And if they get too carried away, then they'll call the police in. But as a general rule, they don't go after a jaywalker.
Sure. Okay. So free speech, but also rule of law in a way that when it comes to the campus free speech, you would be more in favor of, clearing out those encampments sooner rather than letting them linger.
Well, again, if they're breaking the law and they're restricting access, yes, clear them out.
Yeah. Well, campuses are interesting. I mean, this is just a, interesting aside. It might not be illegal for somebody to camp out in the middle of Harvard, but it's against Harvard's rules of conduct.
Sure.
So
well, everybody needs to follow the rules. And if you get admitted to a university, you're submitting to those rules. And if you violate those rules, you can be removed.
Yeah. So, okay. And there's also one more irony that I'll just point out for listeners. I'm sure you'll agree with this. If not, let me know. The irony, I think, specifically of the campus protesters is cancel culture generally has been a left-wing phenomenon of left-wing students and, activists and professors on campus, trying to cancel conservative speakers. And so they did not seem to care about free speech until now it's about them. And now free speech is being used as a bulwark against what seems to be, debatably, but in your opinion, acceptable, legal authority to actually remove them. So there is definitely a double standard there that I think the left has exhibited here in major ways.
I would agree with you.
Okay, so the Iran deal. Just to give listeners a little bit of background, right, this is one of the big questions several years ago. Obviously, this was very much a Republican versus Democrat issue, whereas support for Israel has tended to be bipartisan, right? That might be eroding in the future. Republicans tended to be against the Iran deal. Israel was against the Iran deal. Democrats tended to support the Iran deal. And we're in a mess right now with Iran. I mean, there's so much happening with Iran. Obviously, listeners are aware of the ballistic missile shot at Israel. A week ago, the helicopter with the president of Iran disappeared. Again, no clue what happened there. Obviously, you have all sorts of interesting speculations and theories. In Congress, if it came to you, what would you do with Iran, even separate than the Iran deal? I mean, Iran is probably one of the bigger threats to the world order in however way you shape it.
You can't answer that with a specific without more facts around it.
Sure.
But Iran is a terrorist country. The mullahs of Iran implement tyranny. They violate human rights all the time of their own people. They fund terrorism with Hezbollah and Hamas. And I'm baffled that so many Democrats want to continue to support Iran. You had, John Kerry and President Obama and President Biden giving aid and comfort, really, to Iran, giving them piles of cash, allowing them to make money on their oil in a way that is harmful to Western interest. That puzzles me that they would do that. I think they're wrong.
Yeah, to take the steelman approach of defending them. I was also against the Iran deal, just for listeners. I agree with you, but I'll give the strongest possible defense. If Biden was sitting here, what I at least hoped he would say. I don't know if it would come out the same way, but what he would say is, we were trying to top down make sure that Iran, with all the checks and balances of the Iran deal, did not develop a nuclear weapon. And the way to do that was to ensure that there was no, wider blockade so that the people of Iran and the Persian people were safe. And this way we actually get in the door and are able to every once in a while show up and check the nuclear reactors. Whereas what Trump did by pulling out of it is sort of motivated Iran to develop a nuclear bomb even quicker.
I would tell President Biden he's naive and weak, and I'd ask him, how has it worked out? It's not worked out at all the way he thinks about it. They're continuing the development of their nuclear capacity, and they're continuing to fund terrorism with money that we provide. I think he's a failed president in that regard.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things, you of course know this because you've done your research, we have a lot of Persians in this district who are going to be voting. I do most of my shopping at Wholesome Choice, which is, I think one of the de facto Persian centers. My wife is also Persian. Her parents both fled Iran during the revolution, and so she's a part of the big Persian Jewish community in Los Angeles. Most of the Persian community that's here are specifically here because they don't want to be in Iran. The number of Masa Amini posters that you see in Wholesome Choice every week. There's been protests, on the corner of Culver and Michelson.
I've been out there on that protest.
Okay.
Yes.
And what's so ironic, and this is something that baffles me about liberals and more progressives in general, is the Iranian regime is probably the most illiberal government. At least top 3 that exist in the world right now, right? My wife's aunt still has family in Iran, so she travels back and forth. And, I was over at their house a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about having to get a hijab to go there because it's not legal for a woman to walk around in the street unless their hair's covered. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? But yet there's so much support for this in ways in which when the U.S. tries
support for this meaning, what is this?
Among liberals and progressives, there tends to be an implicit support for respecting the way of life of the most, vicious fundamentalists, that if that happened in America, they would, claim, this is a, hostile Christian takeover for things that aren't as much. And when we try to say, hey, what happened to freedom of speech and freedom of religion and, the basic idea that women don't have to go outside, with their face covered, they say, well, it's just, cultural imperialism when we try to push our values there. I'm curious, I'd be shocked if you disagreed, but what are your thoughts about, this gets into even thoughts of cultural relativism versus objective truth and...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the irony is most of the protesters that are protesting even on these campuses, they would be shot in Gaza for what they believe. And so there's so many people that are like hypocritical or inconsistent or lacking in knowledge of what the disagreements are really all about. So I think there needs to be a lot more conversation on facts. There's an expression on, the lower the facts are, the higher the opinion is. And I think that applies in this situation and in Iran.
Yeah. And I'm curious, so if you've been out on this protest, I'm sure you're, somewhat involved with the local, Persian community. And I'm curious, you don't have to answer this question, but I'm curious, do you have any numbers? Do you think you're going to get a good amount of the local Persian vote? Again, you can opt out of the question.
We're going after all the votes. Hindus, Persians, Chinese, Koreans, Vietnamese. This is a very ethnically diverse community. In fact, you could learn a lot about world affairs just campaigning in this district. So we're going after all of them.
Sure.
And by the way, it's a common theme. We don't really get into hyphenated Americans, right? We look at what does it mean to be an American? It's like we believe in freedom, we believe in opportunity, we believe in flourishing. We also believe that inflation's too high and the border needs to be secured, and we need to enforce our criminal laws. It's like all of those affect everybody, regardless of what ethnicity you are.
Yeah, and this is one of the more interesting differences of Republicans and Democrats these days is Democrats tend to lead with identity and Republicans tend to try to lead with values. Now, sometimes I agree with those values, sometimes I disagree with those values, but at least when it comes to Republicans, I can isolate a value there and either say, Scott, I agree with you, or Scott, I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong on this one. Whereas it is harder when it's based off of identity, because if I came in here and as I said, well, as a Jew, whatever, what are you going to say? No, you don't as a Jew, right? Like, you almost stop the conversation. And so I think it does go back into that wider intellectual inquiry there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before. So the other interesting Middle East phenomenon that seems like it's been stalled. There's been some interesting developments in the last couple of months when it comes to the wider Abraham Accords, but really, the wider eroding of the sort of anti-Israel bloc in the Middle East. And now it seems like it's becoming much more of a Iran versus the West bloc in the Middle East. Obviously, under Trump is when the Abraham Accords were officially signed. There were previous certainly Israeli governments that were working on this ahead of time. It seems like it's somewhat been stalled, but I'm curious, just from a bird's eye perspective, your thoughts on the Middle East, the Abraham Accords. You can sort of start wherever, and I'll.
Well, it's no surprise that you frame it as Iran versus Israel. I mean, Iran is funding the terrorism, so it's not hard to figure out what's going on. Then we saw the recent attack with the rockets launch, and you can't assume they weren't trying to inflict some damage. But I think it's instructive because of the Abraham Accords that you had Jordan and Saudi Arabia and other countries participating in the defense and knocking those rockets down. And so I think that's progress. And even though it doesn't look like the Middle East right now is making progress, I think that's a strong sign of progress, and we need to continue that leadership.
Yeah, no, I think actually the most significant event, I think you're totally right, out of the Middle East this year after October 7th is Saudi Arabia and Jordan knocking down Iranian missiles. I mean,
I think we agree on so much. You should vote Republican.
I love it. I don't think I've ever officially announced on my podcast my political leanings. I mean, most listeners can probably tell, if you listen to the sum total. Listen, this next election, I think a lot of people are undecided as of now. I mean, I really think more than any other election that I can remember talking to students and talking to friends and talking to just, people both in California 47th, but also just nationally, there's a lot up in the air right now. And especially for the Jewish community. I mean, we can start to bring it back locally for a minute. I mean, the Jewish community is terrified in a lot of ways right now because, we always knew anti-Israel bias that morphs into anti-Semitism existed on the fringe. The Soviet Union was famously, virulently anti-Semitic, and they claimed it was just anti-Zionism. I did a podcast about that a couple episodes ago if listeners are interested. But nobody thought that would take over mainstream institutions such as universities and everything there. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And again, the reason why I opened with liberalism is that capital L liberalism, not being a liberal or conservative, has been really good for the Jews, right? For most of Jewish history, Jews were treated as a identity and a group, right? So if you go to the Middle Ages, whether under Christendom or whether under the Islamic world, it wasn't Daniel. It was, you're a Jew, and so you live in the Jewish village or the ghetto or the city. You don't have equal rights both in the Christian and the Islamic world. And America really was that first country to basically say, I'm not Daniel the Jew, I'm Daniel the American, and I can tap into Judaism, I cannot tap into Judaism, no one cares, no one's trying to convince me to be Jewish or not to be Jewish, no one's saying I can only say this or go to this job because I'm Jewish.
And isn't that beautiful in America?
It is beautiful.
Whether you're Jewish or Hindu or Persian, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of America.
Yeah, and so the fear is that now, the reason why I opened with liberalism so strongly is that that's eroding now. Certainly it's eroding from the left when it now is becoming back about identity again, right? If Jews, I am no longer Daniel the person who teaches at UCI, I am Daniel the Zionist Jew who teaches at UCI, right? So that switched. But also, the liberalism in some ways is being mirrored on, pockets of the far right. And so just to say that the Jewish community, I think, is very much confused and looking for, looking for someone to throw them a life raft or something like that, because this is the most amount of turmoil I've seen in the American Jewish community. I mean, I'm not that old, but, even from understanding history since really the World War II.
I think the left has shown their true colors. They're so much into identity politics that they've lost the spirit of the American way of life. And so much of and I'm talking about the rational left. Friends of mine that are liberals that are being canceled right now. And so the progressive left has taken over so much of the party and gone down the identity politics path so much that they've lost sight. And I think the Jewish community and many other communities, or even the Hispanic community, they're looking at that and they're saying, all this promise that the left has promised to us is not happening. It's not coming to fruition. We have inflation, we have crime, and we have open borders, and we don't like that. And so we want. So now they're taking a different look at Republicans, and you're going to see more and more of them coming to the Republican Party.
Yeah, and I don't remember if I mentioned this to you when we met to set up this podcast or someone else. It seems like it's switching from more identity to more based off of either class or really education. I mean, it's I don't know if that tells you something about universities in a good or bad way, right? You can spin this into a positive or a negative light. The higher, on average, someone's education status, the more of a chance they're going to vote Democrat now. And right, this also associated with class in a lot of ways that is very interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of those people are pursuing degrees that don't have any value in the marketplace. It's all good and theoretical, and you when you're young, you want to explore all the possibilities, but when you graduate, you got to get a job. And I think a lot of those degrees are not good in the marketplace, and so people are starting to become disillusioned with public education. With getting a higher degree, you come out with $100,000 or $200,000 in debt, and you don't have a job. There's something broken in that system, and so I think people are taking a new look at it.
Yeah. Do you have any, thoughts or your potential future plans? I mean, this tension of, even federal university. UCI is technically government funded. California government, it also gets federal funding. It is shocking that interplay breeds a type of ideology. Again, not all of it, right? I want to maintain some nuance, but there's no institution that's more critical of America than the universities that America is funding. And so there's a little bit of an irony there. On the one hand, that's a good thing, right? It's good to have institutions that are able to criticize the government, right? Sure. I think we'd all agree there. There's also a time where I think a lot of people are disillusioned by the university because at the end of the day, most Americans, we have maybe you have complaints, nothing's perfect, but most Americans like America. It's, and so do you have any thoughts about just wider federal funding for both?
I think it's a pendulum, and you're going to see universities more and more struggling, paying their bills in the sense that there's not going to be a demand for a lot of what they're offering. And so the pendulum will swing back, and people will go into trade schools and do something where they can actually earn a living, as opposed to get some degree in theory that has no practical application in the real world.
Yeah, is that something you would actively recommend? If there's any, I'm going to guess the youngest of my listeners are usually college students, so it might be, too late for them in terms of your at least
I don't think it's a recommendation of me. I think it's a reality of the marketplace. The market will clean this thing up a bit. And I think when people realize they can't get a job, and these parents are funding all this university education, and their kids can't get a job, I think they're going to start taking a second look at whether they want to fund the next kid that goes through there. So the market will take care of that a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. So talking about the market, and this will just be the last main question, and then I have a couple just last minute questions for you. You've been really generous with your time. Talking about the marketplace, right? Obviously, technology, both in a good and bad and just scary way, is proliferating. Things such as deepfake videos and TikTok and misinformation. I see something and I don't know if it's true. I talk to somebody in a chat and I don't know if that's ChatGPT or that's Scott or that's a ChatGPT sent up to mirror Scott. AI also potentially is going to majorly shake up the job market. There tends to be a fear. I remember very explicitly, I'm forgetting the year, but when Mark Zuckerberg was called into Congress, and you have all these congressmen questioning him about Facebook and ads and how he makes money. And I sort of had a, for no pun intended, my come to Jesus moment of, oh my goodness, nobody in Congress actually understands what they're legislating about. They're talking about Facebook. Yeah. And some of the questions, people on both sides are asking is, well, how do you make money? When that was the entire point, is that they were making money through selling data. So I'm curious, what do you think a future congressman needs in order to be able to tackle? Obviously not everybody can have PhDs in, artificial intelligence and data science and everything, but it is sort of a new world. You're going to be legislating on things that haven't even been invented yet. So I'm curious if you have broader thoughts about that.
Well, the paramount thought for me is, I don't mind the market developing new technology. In fact, it's been wonderful for all of us, for our health and a lot of reasons, our comfort in life. But privacy is a big deal. I mean, privacy is probably the number one concern. And if all of this technology allows people to penetrate privacy in a way that is inappropriate, I think you're going to have some pretty strong regulations. I don't know that we know what the answer is right now, because it's all moving around pretty fast. But I think you're going to see in some campaigns possibly AI is going to be misused or something like that. And there's going to be defamations and lawsuits and things like that. The problem with it in a campaign is you can't get to a defamation lawsuit fast enough to fix the damage that's done. And so we're going to have to really think that forward and figure out the right solution to deter bad behavior.
Got it. So just two last minute questions. Just, these are also listeners, wrote in these questions to me on social media. Is there a specific platform, or what do you think the best quality or platform of Democrats are? Is there one thing, obviously we talked about inflation on the border in the Middle East. Is there something that Democrats have that you say, they actually have a good point, on this one question?
I can't think of anything right now. It doesn't mean I don't believe that. Nothing comes to my mind, because I do believe in intellectual hospitality. I believe in sitting down with Democrats. I did it in California, in the California legislature. We'd sit down together and we'd come up with a better solution than we could on our own. And I think we need to do that more and more.
And just to tease that out a bit, is that because specifically out of the disagreement, both sides have to sort of reanalyze their own views and recrystallize in terms of the back and forth?
Yeah, you come with a prejudice to most issues. And sometimes your prejudice can be overcome with facts. And that only happens if you have a dialogue and a conversation. But right now, it's like there's no dialogue conversation going on, and we've got $35 trillion in debt. We have open borders, and we have inflation going crazy. It's like, so while nothing's happening over here with a real dialogue, you got real existential threats going on over here. And that's what my campaign's all about, is dealing with those issues. Let's deal with those fundamental issues first. And then all these other things can sort out. But if people don't have jobs and they don't have enough money, they're picking between gasoline and food, those are real problems.
Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you'd want listeners to know? Any specific platforms you have, any specific ideas that you have that I just didn't ask you about?
I've never answered that question when a reporter asked me that. So
fair.
Yeah, so if you have more questions, I'll answer them. But my platform is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. We need to deal with inflation, we need to deal with our debt, we need to deal with our crime, and we need to deal with our open border.
Got it. So let's actually go back to the border, because this is, I think, the fifth or sixth time that you've mentioned it. In your mind, what is the problem with the border? I mean, past it being too open. I mean,
Are you kidding me? Since Joe Biden has been president, we've had over 10 million illegal immigrants come across the border. That's on top of the 20 million illegal immigrants that were already in the country. If you don't see that as a problem, it's like, I think we might not agree on everything, but I think you'll see that as a problem. And that can be fixed right now. That could be stopped right now. The president has the authority to do that. And so just think about all the collateral consequences of 10 million people coming in and even more following. And so that needs to be stopped right away.
And what do you make of, and this is a little bit murky in my head, I haven't read about this for a couple weeks, so you can feel free, and listeners should, this goes for anything both of us say, anyone ever says, fact check. But a couple months ago, Congress was trying to pass some bill that Trump was trying to veto because it would be bad. At least how I read it in the media, you can tell me that was biased, is that it was Trump wanted to shoot that down because it would be bad for the campaign, because the border tends to be a strong Republican issue here. Do you know what I'm talking about? I know it's a very vague question.
Yeah. I think you've seen that more recently. Yeah. And even Christine Sinema said this is a game of politics. Quit playing the game with people's lives. It wasn't so much about Trump. It was about the issue. Those measures you're talking about continue to allow the flow of illegal immigration in when it can be stopped right now. So I think the Chuck Schumer tried to play a game with it recently, and even members of his own party called him out on it.
Got it. And then I guess I'll just ask one more question. We'll take another two minutes. Trump is such a polarizing figure. I think it'd be a very different election if it was, Nikki Haley, say, and I won't ask you your opinions on any, on Nikki Haley or not, but what would you say to somebody who maybe has agreed with 95% of what you've said, and maybe will listen to my interview with David Min and disagrees with 90% of what he says, but at the end of the day, this person thinks, I just can't vote for a party that Trump is the leader of. I'm curious what your message would be to those people.
Well, the bottom line is there's a separation of powers in this country. There's a presidency, there's a Congress, there's a judiciary. And I'm running for Congress. And Congress plays a critical role in solving these problems. In fact, the intellectual hospitality that I was talking about, we need to sit down, Republicans with Republicans and Republicans with Democrats, and come up with some of these solutions, because it's not just about one person. It's about solving a problem for a lot of people. And until we get roll up our sleeves, so to speak, and get to work on those issues, we're going to continue to see runaway inflation. Our debt is going to be $50 trillion in another 8 years. Social Security is going to be insolvent in 8 years, and Medicare is going to be insolvent. These are real problems that we have to solve, and so that's why I'm running for Congress.
Yeah. Well, Scott Baugh, thank you so much, and good luck in the upcoming election.
Hey, pleasure. Thank you.